Thank you very much. Yes, it's arguably the first presentation ever being given at the British Hypertension Society which contains no science. However, let me remind you of the wonderful aperitif we had before lunch with the science and medicine underlying obesity. But I would also remind you that rarely can you divorce medicine from politics and economics. And there's probably no more demonstrable area in medicine where these three are so closely interrelated. So I'm going to say just a little bit about the politics and economics. So the title is Big Food and Global Health. Now, earlier on this year, for those of you who read the Tory rags, you will have noted the following, that there are almost 3 times as many deaths globally from obesity than there are from malnutrition. If you look at the world's population, clearly our global food systems don't meet our dietary needs. There are over 2 billion members of the world who are overweight, and that's defined as a BMI of more than 25, and of those more than a quarter are frankly obese. You'll all be familiar with the global maps of obesity, which highlight the high-income economies, the developed world, where approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of adults are obese. But the problem is now developing rapidly in the lower and middle income economies, where obesity rates are increasing dramatically. If you look at projections for global population growth, as shown in the slide on the left there, you will see that most of this growth is, of course, occurring in the low middle income economies, and that's where the future problems of overweight, obesity, and related global burden of disease will be found. This slide shows the change in death rates attributable to non-communicable diseases between 2008 and projected to 2030, and you see on the right-hand end of the slide there in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa that there is a projected marked increase in deaths from non-communicable diseases once the infectious disease problem has been largely catered for, and that in terms of obesity is a major contribution to those NCD deaths. So in 2013, obesity is the 4th leading cause of deaths and disability. It contributes to almost half of the diabetes burden, between 1/4 and 1/3 of coronary heart disease and stroke deaths. And in fact, if you look at Salim Yusuf's Inter-Heart study, where they assessed obesity not by BMI but by waist circumference, which is a probably much better measure of abdominal obesity, about 63% of CHD deaths were due to abdominal obesity. As we heard this morning from John Hall, about 2/3 of the hypertensive disease burden can be attributed to obesity, and we know well that many cancers are obesity related, as indeed are a host of musculoskeletal problems. If you turn to the economics of obesity, both the direct and indirect costs, you can see these remarkable figures from the United States and the United Kingdom, between $30 and almost $200 billion per year, and the sums are increasing. Now, I don't want to insult this audience over the etiology of being fat. It is simply a balance between what you take in and what you expend. And what's clearly happened over the last few decades is that there's been an excess dietary intake of energy-dense, poor nutrient foods, largely fats, refined carbohydrates, combined with a lack of physical activity and an increasing sedentary lifestyle, and the factors such as genetic susceptibility, endocrine and metabolic factors play a very, very minor role. Now, there are another group of important etiological contributing factors that are shown on this slide, and it is evident, certainly in the higher income economies, that there have been no policies in terms of health, education, the whole process of food manufacturing, distribution, marketing and sales, together with lack of policies in urban planning and transportation. And these have clearly contributed to the overall problem. Now, turning to the topic of the talk, which is big food, and this is now an increasingly recognized term, which refers to a relatively small number of transnational corporations that control the food that we eat. They control the production, they control the distribution of these ultra-processed substances, and including soft drinks that are throughout the world. And many of these are synthesized from cheap substances that are extracted from the remnants of animals, together with inexpensive ingredients, including refined sugars, really very important, starches, fats, and oil derivatives. This is a slide which I've stolen from Graham McGregor and which I suspect will be shown in the next talk, so I'll pass that one by. But the bottom line from this is that these foodstuffs are energy dense, they are nutrient poor, and they're high in fat, salt, and refined carbohydrates. Now, there are some other key issues about big food. Big food spends billions of dollars on the subject of palatability. It's making rubbish food taste better. And that's why, for those of you who, rather like me, shun McDonald's, you know jolly well that when you go back to your childhood, you thought McDonald's was fantastic. And it's fantastic because it tastes good. And McDonald's have spent millions and millions of dollars making sure that what you buy in your quarter pounder with cheese tastes good. The second thing that they do is that they extend shelf life, so that particularly in the developing world, in hot countries, that foods can be have long shelf lives. You can consume them anywhere. It is interesting that I'm not sure that I recall the percentages now, but in the United Kingdom, there's something like 10% of houses do not have a dining table or a kitchen table. Food is consumed on the couch, in a chair, as you're walking, in the office. It is not consumed formally at meal times, and that's why, of course, it's termed fast food. You have to realize that the food manufacturers are there to make money. They are not there to provide the right sort of food which is ideal for your health. The big food companies now control, in our economies, more than 50% of all the food that's sold in the developing world. It's around about 10%, but it's rising rapidly. Of all the soft drinks, the high refined carbohydrate soft drinks on the shelves, then more than 50% of those are produced by Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. And of the processed foods, 3/4 of the world's food sales are produced by big food. This is a photograph taken not that long ago from an American grocery store, and the message behind that, I think, is self-evident. And this slide is quite an interesting slide, a sort of hub and spoke slide which highlights some of the big food producers: Nestle, Kraft, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, something Mills, I can't remember what the title is there, Kellogg's and so on, and all the peripheral companies and products that they control. One of the problems that is now evident in the developing world, in the emerging economies, is that in order to increase the profits and the income and benefits to shareholders, that big food's got to move into the low middle income economies, because there is a degree of saturation, which I'll show in a minute, of sales in the high economic markets. In Asia, Africa, Latin America, the increase in sales from one of the largest big food companies is around about 25% per year. Absolutely huge. And this slide shows you an example of what I've just said. These are the high-income countries, and you can see between about 2009 and projected to 2015 that there's a sort of plateauing of sales of packaged foods and soft drinks, whereas in the low and middle income economies you can see that there is a steady increase in sales of these products, and that is simply to appease the shareholders. Interestingly, there's a remarkable relationship between sales of processed foods and soft drinks with the sales of alcohol and tobacco. And although neither I nor the authors of this paper have produced regression lines, I think it's pretty self-evident that they are strikingly related. And if you look at the right-hand column here of this slide, you will see the change in sales volume of many processed and packaged foods, canned foods, frozen foods, ready meals, and so on, increase by between 20 and 40% over a 5-year period. This is an absolutely colossal change. Now, there are other, perhaps less well-realized consequences of the actions of big food. They displace long-established traditional food systems. For many, we don't have meals anymore, we just snack or graze. Family and community life is altered as a consequence. It's had a devastating effect, even in your high street and my high street, of local food producers and distributors. They're simply driven out of business. Their shops are largely replaced by the charity shops, certainly in my local villages, as the Tesco's and the Sainsbury's and so on move in. And social networks collapse, and cultural identity is affected. So it's had a colossal impact, not only where we live, but in the rest of the world. Big food's the driving force behind the enormous increase in the sales and consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages and processed foods enriched with salt, sugar, and fat. What is absolutely remarkable to me is that if you go to the African continent, something like 95% of the sales of PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are full sugar strength. It costs more to produce sugar Coca-Cola than it does Diet Coke, but in the developing world, 95% of the sales are full sugar content soft drinks. And of course, they're the major contributors to diabetes and this shift that we've seen over the last decade from type 2 diabetes, a disease hitherto amongst the 40s and 50-year-olds, we're now seeing in the teens and early 20s, particularly in the developing world. In the period of 1977 to 2004, the caloric intake from soft drinks was doubled in the United States, and it's been assessed that about 20% of the weight gain in the US population is simply due to the overconsumption of these high-calorie sweetened beverages. Now, obviously, concern has been expressed about the impact of big food. So what does it do? Well, it tries to create a more favourable image. Most evident, of course, in the United Kingdom last year. The major sponsors of the 2012 Olympics were who? Coca-Cola. A nice example from the United States. The soft drink industry gave the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia $10 million at precisely the time that the city of Philadelphia was about to impose a soda tax, which was never actually imposed. And there are a whole host of examples of activities that the food industry has been responsible for, advertising initiatives apparently designed to shift the mix of foods and encourage healthier dietary choices and lifestyles. I mean, that simply has not happened. Instead, there's been a tidal wave of marketing of bad foods. The burgers get bigger. There's ever more apparently sophisticated sugary beverages. The industry has developed more creative ways of marketing, particularly to children, and indeed promoting unhealthy foods in the developing world. So if you want to take away a single message, it is as follows. The food industry distorts science. It creates front groups to do its bidding. It compromises science, professional organizations, community groups, and it blocks public health policies. It has been hugely successful at blocking public health policies to control the consequences of the vastly spreading processed foods that we're all familiar with. And I'm not going to go into the detail of some of the tricks that PepsiCo and Coca-Cola have gone into. Just at the bottom line there, $27 million spent by PepsiCo since 2000 in lobbying government in the United States. And despite the increasing pressure from consumers and public health advocates concerned about obesity, these large organizations have essentially done done nothing. So what are the challenges that we face? Well, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that we, as a profession, have failed to recognize the importance of obesity for the burden of disease not only in our own countries but in the developing world. As you heard from John Hall before lunch, the 2011 United Nations Conference on NCDs made no mention whatsoever of the role of agribusiness and processed foods in obesity. How on earth you could have a conference on non-communicable diseases and not discuss obesity in 2011 beggars belief. And we need action to tackle the vested interests and the problems that the big food industry has with strong ties to influence over national governments. Interestingly, if you go back a couple of decades and you explore what the tobacco companies did when concerns began to arise about the adverse health effects of tobacco consumption, it is clearly evident that there were extraordinary lengths to which they went to avoid or flout public health interventions that might threaten their profits. Now, the same people that were working in the tobacco industry 10 to 20 years ago are now working with big food, and they're employing precisely the same tactics to flout public health measures to curb obesity, which in the long run, were they to be effective, would affect the sales of their commodities. It took 50 years after we began to understand the link between tobacco consumption and cancer and heart disease for effective public health measures to be introduced. Are we really going to have to wait 50 years to do something about big food? Now, there are various ways that, in theory, you could go about this. You could have voluntary regulation. You could have partnerships between industry and public health. Or, as we will see in a minute, the only alternative is actually regulation of the food companies. The United Nations Secretary General urged the food industry to be more responsible, with particular emphasis on companies marketing processed foods to children. Now, if ever there was an example of pissing in the wind, this is probably it. Absolutely hopeless. In the United Kingdom, we're really not very much better. The UK Health Minister quoted as stating, "The food and drinks industry is not only part of the problem but part of the solution." Some wishy-washy, rather wet statement. Corporate responsibility alongside government action could make a difference. Well, it could, but it won't. Partnerships with industry, well, yes, it's a nice idea, but it's never worked. So we're clearly aware of the fact that there are major conflicts of interest between the corporations that profit from selling us bad food and public health. Because at the end of the day, it is profit that drives big food. It has a mandate to do that from its shareholders, that self-regulation of the food industry by the food industry is doomed to failure. We've no evidence to date of an alignment of public health in curbing obesity with the food and beverage industry. And in order to promote health, the industry would need to market healthier foods, but it costs more to produce healthier foods. So who's responsible? Is it you, me? Is it the public? Is it the healthcare providers? Is it the educationalists? Does the media need to have some sort of regulation imposed on it to stop it marketing rubbish foods to children? Something like £130 million per year spent by the food industry marketing bad cereals to children. Is it the food manufacturers? Clearly they're not going to do it. Is it the government? The answer is yes, almost certainly. And perhaps I might pose the question to you, what is the British Hypertension Society going to do about it? You know, we have a clear case that 2/3 of the disease for which we have some sort of responsibility for is caused by obesity. And yet, I'm afraid we've not done very much. The answer has got to be regulation. If you look at attempts at regulation across the world, it's been disastrous. I'm sure John Hall is much more familiar with this than I am, but attempts to introduce soda taxes in more than 20 states in America have been fought successfully by the lawyers on behalf of the big food companies. In addition, there have been massive advertising campaigns to stop taxation, and they've been successful. And in the United Kingdom, there was an extensive report of the Royal Colleges on obesity, but government has simply ignored it. So let me wind up by saying that, again, that big food distorts science. It creates front groups to do its bidding. It compromises scientists, professional organizations, and community groups. It blocks what we need in terms of public health. At the end of the day, the food industry, like other industries, has got to be regulated because at the end of the day, that's the only way we will protect the public good. Left to regulate itself, big food has the opportunity, if not the mandate from its shareholders, to sell more junk foods irrespective of their impact. So at the end of the day, it's regulation, not collaboration. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've got the same slides to finish my talk as John Hall had. A third of our dogs are now fat, our obese cats, numbers are soaring, and even the rabbits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Super talk, incredibly depressing, I have to say, and very, very sad. I think I'm sure I'm not the only parent in the room who feels completely depressed by it. Clearly regulation would be the way forward, but where would you start with all of that? If you had to do one thing that would make a difference, what do you think it would be? Because in its entirety, it seems insoluble.
I think national bodies such as the British Heart Foundation, the British Hypertension Society, UK Diabetes and so on should exert as much pressure as they can on government to introduce regulation. I mean, that's what happened in the case of tobacco, and big food's killing just as many people as tobacco does. And we see no sign whatsoever of government trying to take any role in this. There's no education. There's no education in the schools. Interestingly, I mean, as Feng will probably say later on, we're going to China to talk about educating young children about food. We should be doing that in a higher income economy.
So time for a few questions. Okay, we have time for 2 questions.
Peter, there's one thing that worries me when I rail against the excesses of the food industry, and that is my hypocrisy. Because all of us who have a funded pension, all of us who have general investments, will have holdings in these companies. They're the core of any portfolio. So every time a child stuffs an inappropriate burger into its mouth, it makes me richer, and that worries me.
Well, I don't have shares in McDonald's. I don't have shares in tobacco companies. I have to confess to having a few shares in a pharma company, which is all going steadily downhill. But you're quite right. I mean, yeah, you're quite right.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head. And I think it's very impressive that a clinician like you has taken on such an important public health position. I agree with you that the solution is in the kind of regulatory framework, but I think it's helpful to distinguish taxation measures from laws. For example, limiting access, what's provided in certain places, advertising. And something that for a number of years I've suggested is a so-called SAS tax, excise tax, on ready-to-eat food and beverages, which the SAS is for sugar, alcohol, salt, and saturated fat, that would be under the control of a public health authority, that within certain limits mandated by government, they could alter that excise tax. And what is really particularly important is the margins in what you put in food are quite tight. If you make palm oil a bit more expensive because it's largely saturated, you could switch to olive oil. It wouldn't necessarily affect calorie intake, but a sugar tax, which would be part of that, clearly would. I mean, in my own department, there was a student there having healthy cereal, and I looked at the label and pointed out to him that half of what he was eating was pure sugar, and yet it was sold as healthy. Now, a 1p per gram, and that's what I'm thinking of, tax on that would make it expensive for the manufacturers to do it. And if you have it across several food components, they can't say you're picking on sugar, it's not just sugar that makes you fat. So I think the focus should be to introduce excise duties on ready-to-consume foods. So if you buy salt or butter for home cooking, that doesn't count. But everything you showed would be included in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very laudable proposition. I suspect, like so many things, it's too late in the developed world, in the higher income economies. My major concern is with the low and middle income economies, where, for example, there's a village that I go to every year in East Africa, where every single shop, the name is surrounded by a billboard which has got Coca-Cola on it. And 95%, maybe almost 100% of that Coca-Cola is full sugar Coca-Cola. And it's part of the, the first thing you do when you've got a few rupees or cents or whatever the currency is to buy a can of Coca-Cola. You know, it's the sort of forerunner to being fat, is to be demonstrative of affluence in the emerging world. And it's Coca-Cola that's right there from the outset. And why on earth they do not sell low sugar Coca-Cola, I don't know. I suspect it's because they control the sugar production as well. It's part of that network of control.
Okay, I think we'll have to move on in the interest of time, so thank you very much again.